Hi, this is Uri L'Tzedek's Talking Torah and Tzedek. I'm Judry Subar, and I'm here today with Rabbi Steve Greenberg, author, thought leader, activist. Rabbi Steve, how you doing?
A pleasure to be with you, Judd.
Great to have you. To start out, I would like to, first of all, note that one organization that you're involved in is an organization called Eshel. I'd like to ask you a bit about that, and then to follow up with asking you about beyond Eshel and its involvement with LGBTQ issues of inclusion in the Orthodox Jewish community, how your work relates more broadly to other social justice issues. But to start out, tell me a little bit about Eshel.
Eshel began a bit more than a decade ago, and it started off as an organization merely that I say merely, but it was actually quite revolutionary when it happened, is to gather LGBT Orthodox Jews of different kinds into a single space and have a Shabbaton. It was a very powerful emotional insight of a bunch of us who felt that we just weren't finding each other. We weren't looking each other in the eye. And the first Shabbaton, people were weeping at Kabbalat Shabbat just to be in a space that was queer positive and Orthodox or Orthodox related. And among the people in the room, which I think is helpful to understand the work, were modern Orthodox Jews who were struggling to remain connected, were queer Jews who were approaching religious life and were curious and excited about being there, were Hasidic and Yeshivish Jews who were coming under aliases, were married people who were sharing the need to visit a cousin and it wasn't a cousin they were visiting. There were trans people, there were gay people, there were bi people, there were just a whole array of different definitions of orthodoxy and different definitions of queer, all in the same room. And we discovered early on that it was a healing and an incredibly a powerful religious experience just to be in a space where it was okay to be. And from that emerged, I would say, 3 other projects. I think that those of us who began the organization wanted it to move the Orthodox community, but we discovered that the groups so needed each other, and the focus on transformational change was just not why they were there, at least for the vast majority of them. And then we began to open up a warm line, and it turned out that parents of LGBT Jews needed help. So we started a dedicated warm line for parents of LGBT Jews. And then we started a Shabbaton for them as well when a parent said, I want to support that. And so for the past decade, we've filled out Isabella Friedman with 120 LGBT Orthodox Jews of different sorts.
That's the retreat center in Connecticut.
That's correct. And then a separate Shabbaton has kind of continued now for 7 years, which is for parents of LGBTQ Jews, Orthodox parents. And we've discovered that they are actually very interested in a way that LGBTQ people aren't always, in really moving their communities forward, because often LGBTQ people who grow up Orthodox find themselves at odds with their identities and with their families and communities and want to leave. And their tenuous connections often don't provide the strong enough resources for staying, whereas parents are located in their Orthodox communities and are upset at how their children were treated and are a real resource. And in some way, the parents actually fueled a much richer engagement with the question of, I would say, social justice in a way that was really profound. And so there's 3 things we do. We provide community for LGBTQ people, helping them to formulate a way that they can engage with their religious identities and their statuses as people who want love and affection and community. And then we work with Orthodox communities, and now after 10 years, not only with parents, but with allies and with the LGBTQ people who, for the first time, I'd say in the past decade, are deciding not to leave. The usual frame was, if you were Orthodox and gay, you either stayed silent or you left and you spoke out. But to stay and to be honest about who one was an extremely painful, difficult, if not like an unfathomable reality. And over time, because many of us have elected to not leave, there's been a growing movement to really make Orthodoxy more embracing and open for LGBTQ people, initially by just telling stories, and then more pointedly, for pragmatic policy shifts that may or may not have halachic import, but are important for setting standards of how communities run. And so the most exciting thing recently that happened on that score, we've interviewed 175 Orthodox rabbis, congregational rabbis, and we've gotten remarkable answers, remarkable openness, at least in theory, of many rabbis. The difficulty often they have is not with individuals, because they have many individuals that aren't perfectly observant. It's with the status of family that actually it becomes much more complicated for Orthodox rabbis. We've worked with schools and discovered that schools are deeply committed to the well-being of students and struggle in different ways to figure out how to put that into practice. But in both circumstances, what we are learning is that slow, pragmatic change is possible. And that is how we, organize our work with communities, and how we have created a pledge, which is one school agreed to pledge that no kid who would come out during high school would be summarily kicked out of school, that there would be resources if the student needed them, that the student would be included in all manner of the school's social life. And the pledge was actually quite tame, but the admission that there needed to be a transparent response to LGBTQ people when they come out has become actually over time really clear. And so we pushed this pledge into communities across the country, and now more than a dozen schools in some form or another have a transparent space where you can know what will happen when I come out. So that is one achievement. The other achievement is a year-long process by an Orthodox rabbi to work through the questions and to create a space where the community moves together with rabbinic leadership on the pragmatic questions of how far can we and do we go to welcome LGBTQ families. So in those two areas, I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and we're, spearheading much of that work.
That's great. Early on in our conversation here, you used the term transformational change, and then you described a number of ways in which you and your organization are involved in that change. And it seems to me that you're focused both on change in the way people think and change in the way people act. What do you see as the relationship between those?
Well, it's a really good question. Early on in this process, way before Eshel was born, but after I had come out and was still working at the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, I got a grant from an organization to work in the conservative Jewish community on inclusion, and someone else in the organization had kind of put it forward, and I wrote something and they accepted it. And then they asked me, well, maybe we should add a piece of this for the Orthodox community. And I laughed. And they said, why are you laughing? I said, well, your theory of change will work with the conservative community, but it will not work with the Orthodox community. And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, here's your theory of change. You knock on the door, you basically tell someone that they have the wrong idea. They let you in their heads, you change their ideas, and then everything changes.
Sounds lovely.
And I said, that works in certain communities, won't work in the Orthodox community. They said, why not? They said, well, they won't let you in their head.
Hmm.
They won't let you change their ideas. Then they said, well, then what can you do? I said, you knock on the door and offer them the following. You say, you know what, your ideas are your ideas, but can I offer you an expansive frame for growing your sense of empathy? Would you like to, to expand your heart a bit? And they said, that's fascinating. Can you do that? And I said, well, let's try. So here's my frame, is that Orthodoxy prides its independence from social pressure, and for good and bad reasons. Because basically it's a tradition, and therefore modeling itself on the past is what traditions do, and they are skeptical of radical change, and therefore don't do well when change is speedy and profound, and particularly on issues of core value. And so in that frame, you can go into a conservative synagogue, they all agree with inclusion, and they're just struggling with how to emotionally overcome their resistance. That's just not how Orthodoxy is faring, because people sense that this is an abandonment of something. And so the reason we work in Orthodox communities differently is because ideas tend to follow experience and emotion in more traditional environments. Over time, feeling differently and engaging over time in relationship opens up avenues of experience, of thought that were closed prior. So I think thought's an important piece, but generally speaking, which is why, on some level, the halakha doesn't change until it's already changed in the hearts and minds of people. It is often the last step in a process of social reconsideration. And therefore, it's sometimes not useful to provide the plan of halachic transformation, ad shetachpots, until the community is really ready for that change, or at least on the path.
Okay. With those thoughts in mind, I'm wondering about the following. So obviously, you have been and are very involved with LGBTQ issues, but I imagine that you've thought about and observed to one degree or another the ways in which the Orthodox Jewish community has and hasn't made progress with regard to other social justice issues
Right.
of racism and so forth. How do you view where the Orthodox Jewish community is today in North America relative to those issues, based on your experience with the issues that you're most involved with?
So there, one of the conundrums is that while one could claim that there's at least a much more unified Reform Judaism and a unified conservative and Reconstructionist Judaism, Orthodoxy is the most diverse and chaotic and cacophonous of the movements, with no single leadership and no single ideology. So part of the reality that we face is not only that Eshel is speaking to queer people struggling to remain faithful and observant, and speaking to Orthodox communities struggling to figure out how to open their doors. We are also struggling to figure out how to speak to different kinds of Orthodox Jews and different kinds of community structures that are addressing the question. So there are Haredi spaces that are moving, but they're moving in very different ways from centrist Orthodox spaces, and there are progressive spaces that are moving in a yet a different way. So I guess I would say, this is rough and ready, that I've discerned three different kinds of Orthodox spaces in regard to this. I call the first the kind of, idealist, halachic model, where the tradition is really unimpeachable. Therefore, because of that, there cannot really be a person who was made gay by God and then deprived of the benefits of intimacy, love, and companionship. It's just they want to see. I mean, I put it this way before, and it helps to make it simpler. If you have, there are three propositions, only two of which can be true. God is good and just and loving, a good, just, and loving creator lawgiver. Two, the halakha can never be remediated on issues of this sort. It is what it is. And three, gay people can never be made straight with will or prayer or therapy. So one of them is false. The easiest one to falsify is gay people can never be made straight, because then the halakha remains intact and God is good. But the moment you accept that there are gay people who cannot be made straight with will or prayer or therapy, which is what the centrist Orthodox community has slowly come to acknowledge and the Haredi community still struggles to admit, is that then you are stuck with either a bad law or a bad God. And so here's the way I see it. Haredim avoid the conflict by really believing that gayness is an aberration and can be fixed. And if it can't be fixed, that's nebuch, but it should be able to be fixed, right? They don't imagine the possibility that God is cruel or that the law is wrong or needs remediation, because that's way too difficult. There are people in the middle who admit the science of this matter and believe that gay people cannot be transformed into straight people. And therefore, they are, I call them the conflicted traditionalists. And if you look at a document of 2010, I believe, of Rabbi Nati Hefgat and a bunch of centrist Orthodox rabbis and more, I would say, progressive thinkers who wanted to put forth a more thoughtful portrayal of the problem of homosexual identity, the document is riddled with self-contradiction because this is a space where people are trying to be compassionate to a group of people they realize cannot change and are unwilling to admit that they're stuck with a law that they feel they cannot play with. And therefore, they close their eyes to the conflicts that they constantly put us in, kind of embracing us and slapping us around at the same time. And they remain intentionally unwilling to face that. And then there, I would call them the generous Orthodox, because, and there are a bunch of folks, I think the leader of the pack, the first one was Rabbi Yosef Kaneski, to say, we can no longer undermine the health and well-being of LGBTQ people for our theological comfort. We cannot harm people for our theological comfort any longer. The question remains teku, but a teku I take responsibility for, and on some level suffer from too. In other words, the last group is the group that isn't clear about how to transform the law or understand God, but is willing to admit, Houston, there's a problem. And recognizing that they share with us a befuddled, concerned, and maybe even angry response to a tradition that has silenced a piece of the creation and maybe even wounded or crushed it at moments. So I think those are the three groups, right? The blithe traditionalists, the conflicted but unwilling to admit how conflicted they are, people in the middle, and the more liberal community that at this juncture has come so far as to admit profound conflict with the tradition that they actually promulgate and love, but are ready to admit that it troubles them deeply.
I'd like to finish up our conversation by asking you what mechanisms you think are most effective to move those groups, or what mechanisms will hopefully be most effective to move those groups, maybe especially the third one that you talked about, to what you would consider to be a better place?
I have strategies for each. For the first one, the strategy is storytelling and little more. Just tell our stories so that they begin to hear a narrative that is unexpected and challenging to them. Let them figure out, like, I hesitate to tell them what to do on any level, but to tell our stories is hard enough for them to listen to them. The middle group, I put their feet to the fire and get them to do what therapists do, which is help people to admit what they don't want to see. So I have a short story, if I can tell it, is that Rabbi Shmuel Golden has been a friend, and I learned in yeshiva with him, and I asked if I could speak with him a number of years ago about this issue. He said, sure. I came over to the synagogue in New Jersey, and I said, are there gay people in the shul? He said, yeah, there are. There's families, and, my heart goes out to them, Steve, but what can I do? I have to tell them they have to be celibate. I said to him, Shmuel, can we do a role play? So he laughed. He said, sure. I said, okay, my name is Gabe. I'm 16. And Rabbi, I know I'm gay and I'm terrified and scared and confused. What does Hashem want from me? So he didn't say anything. He was silent. And I said, well, would you tell Gabe, Gabe, you will never touch or be touched. You will never dance with someone out of joy. You will never be held in your sadness with someone you love. You will never be cared for when you're sick by someone who knows your body. You will never make love to any human being to the day you die because something is terribly wrong with you. So he looked at me and said, my God, I would never put it that way. I said, well, how would you put it? Mm. He said, I don't know. How would you put it? And I said, try this. Gabe, I don't know. I also don't know why a good and loving God makes gay people and gives them a nearly impossible life. Sure, if you can be celibate for a lifetime without doing great harm to yourself, go ahead, but I doubt that's the case. So I think you should keep 612 mitzvot and do your best with the rest and go to Shamayim with a damn good argument. God is merciful, it'll be all right, and join my shul. I said, could you do that? He said, I think I could. I said, I'm going to push you one more step. And he chuckled and said, okay. I said, and could you say this to Gabe? Gabe, I'm 40 years older than you. I'll probably be in Shamayim when you get there. So I want to make you a promise that the day that you offer that argument in front of the Holy Throne about why you lived the life you lived, know this, I will be behind you, cheering you on. And he began to cry. Yeah. In that middle group, that's my aim. My aim is to make rabbis aware of the conflict, the vice they put us in. And then the third group, who are already aware, I just want to support them and give them courage and maybe cover and help them move forward at the speed that they think they can accomplish it without losing their voice. I consider them allies and friends, and I let them lead on how I can help.
Thank you. Very wonderful insights and thoughts about how the Orthodox Jewish community is dealing with LGBTQ issues and might in the future. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.